The phone camera shook, slightly as the teenage boy zoomed in on the elderly woman's face, catching every tear that rolled down her weathered cheeks. His friends laughed in the background, their cruel voices carrying across the diner's parking lot. "Look at her crying," one of them sneered. "What's wrong, Grandma? Can't hear us making fun of you?" They didn't know she was deaf. Or maybe they did, and that made their torment even more satisfying to them. Either way, Margaret Chin sat on the bench outside Rosie's diner, her small frame trembling as she clutched her purse to her chest, completely unaware of the mocking commentary, but entirely aware of the phone pointed at her like a weapon, of the circle of young faces twisted with cruelty. At 73 years old, she had seen humanity at its worst during her childhood in a world that didn't always accommodate difference. But she had also seen it at its best. She just couldn't see it right now, not through the blur of tears and the ache of humiliation that made her feel small and powerless and utterly alone. Margaret had only stopped at the diner for a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, a Tuesday afternoon ritual she'd maintained since her husband, Henry, passed 2 years ago. The waitress inside knew her order by heart. Always made sure to face Margaret when speaking so she could read lips. Always wrote down the total on a slip of paper with a smiley face drawn at the bottom. These small kindnesses had kept Margaret tethered to the world of the living when grief threatened to pull her under. But today, as she'd left the diner with her takeout bag, counting out her change with arthritic fingers, she'd accidentally dropped a $20 bill. The wind had carried it across the parking lot, and she'd shuffled after it as quickly as her bad hip would allow. That's when the teenagers had spotted her, had watched her chase the bill with growing amusement, had decided she would be their entertainment for the afternoon. One of them had stepped on the 20 just as Margaret reached for it. She'd looked up, confused, to see 5 young faces staring down at her. Their mouths were moving, but she couldn't make out what they were saying with the sun in her eyes. She'd pointed to her ears and shaken her head, the universal gesture she'd used thousands of times to indicate her deafness. That's when their expressions had changed from mere amusement to something darker. That's when the phones had come out. They'd formed a circle around her, taking turns picking up her 20 and dangling it just out of reach. When she'd tried to push past them, one boy had grabbed her purse strap, not hard enough to steal it, but hard enough to frighten her. She'd stumbled backward, landing hard on the bench, and that's when the tears had come. Not from physical pain, though her hip screamed in protest, but from the sheer cruelty of it all. From the realization that she was completely vulnerable, that no amount of pleading would reach them because she couldn't speak clearly, enough for them to understand, and they weren't interested in understanding anyway. The rumble started low, like distant thunder on a summer day. Margaret felt it before she heard it, a vibration that traveled through the bench and up her spine. The teenagers felt it too. Their laughter died as they turned toward the street, where a dozen motorcycles were pulling into the parking lot, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun, their engines growling like protective beasts. The lead rider was a mountain of a man, his leather vest decorated with patches and pins earned over decades of riding. His name was Marcus Bear Thompson, and he'd been riding these roads for 30 years. Behind him came his crew, men and women of all ages, united by their love of the open road and an unspoken code that you protected those who couldn't protect themselves. Bear killed his engine and swung his leg over the bike in one fluid motion. He'd seen enough in those first few seconds to understand the situation. An elderly woman crying on a bench, teenagers with phones out, a dropped $20 bill on the ground. He didn't need to hear the audio to know what was being said. He'd seen this kind of cruelty before, and it made something dark and angry rise in his chest. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Bear said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made smart people pay attention. The teenagers looked up at him, their bravado faltering as they took in his 6'4" frame, the scars on his knuckles, the cold fury in his eyes. "Seems like you boys are having some fun. Mind if we join in?" The tallest teenager, the ringleader, tried to recover his swagger. "We're just hanging out, man. Not your business." Bear took a step closer, and the rest of his crew dismounted, forming a wall of leather and denim behind him. "See, that's where you're wrong," Bear said softly. "When I see 5 grown boys terrorizing an elderly woman, that becomes my business. That becomes all our business." He gestured to the crew behind him. "Now I'm going to give you one chance to do the right thing. You're going to apologize to this lady. You're going to give her back her money, and you're going to delete those videos from your phones. Right now. Or what? The teenager challenged, though his voice cracked slightly. Bear smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Or we call the police and show them the footage from those security cameras. He pointed to the diner's exterior. I'm sure the cops would be real interested in what looks like attempted robbery of a senior citizen. That's a felony in this state, boys. That's prison time. The color drained from the teenagers' faces as they looked up at the cameras. They'd never noticed. Bear watched them calculate their options and come up empty. We didn't mean anything, the ringleader stammered. We were just joking around. Joking, Bear repeated flatly. He turned to Margaret, who was watching the exchange with wide, confused eyes. Bear crouched down in front of her, making sure she could see his face. He spoke slowly and clearly, exaggerating his lip movements. Ma'am, are you okay? Did they hurt you? Margaret's eyes filled with fresh tears. But these were different. She shook her head and placed a trembling hand on Bear's arm. She pulled out a small notepad from her purse, something she always carried for communication, and wrote in, "Careful script. Thank you for helping me. I'm just scared." Bear felt something crack in his chest. His own mother had been deaf, had faced this same kind of cruelty before she passed. He nodded and wrote on the notepad, "You're safe now. We won't leave until they're gone." He stood and turned back to the teenagers, holding up the notepad so they could see Margaret's words. "She's deaf," he said, his voice hard as iron. "She couldn't hear a word you were saying, but she knew you were being cruel. She knew you were mocking her. And you filmed it like it was some kind of trophy." He shook his head in disgust. "My mother was deaf. She dealt with people like you her whole life. I swore when she died that I'd never let it happen again if I could help it." The ringleader's face crumpled. Whatever defiance he'd been clinging to evaporated, replaced by shame. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm really sorry. I didn't think—" "No, you didn't think," Bear agreed. "But you're going to think now. You're going to think about what it feels like to be vulnerable and scared and alone. And you're going to be better." He held out his massive hand. "Money, phone, now." The teenager handed over Margaret's 20 and his phone. One by one, his friends did the same. Bear watched as each boy deleted the videos, checked their recently deleted folders, and emptied those too. Then he made each of them write an apology to Margaret in her notepad, made them hand her the money directly, made them look her in the eyes as they did it. When it was done, Bear escorted the teenagers to their car. "You boys go home," he said, "and you think real hard about the kind of men you want to be. Because right now you're not men at all. You're cowards. But you don't have to stay that way." As the car pulled away, Bear returned to Margaret. His crew had surrounded her, not threateningly, but protectively. One of the women, a rider named Jackie, was sitting beside her on the bench holding her hand. Another had gone into the diner and returned with fresh coffee and pie. Bear sat down on Margaret's other side and wrote in the notepad, "Can we give you a ride home? Want to make sure you get there safe." Margaret looked around at the circle of weathered, tattooed faces, at these rough-looking strangers who had appeared like guardian angels, and she smiled. She wrote, "I would like that very much. Thank you for seeing me, for making me feel like I matter." Bear read the words and had to clear his throat. "Ma'am," he said aloud, though he knew she couldn't hear him. Then wrote on the pad, "You matter more than you know." They helped Margaret onto the back of Jackie's bike, secured her purse, and made sure she was comfortable. Then, with Margaret holding tight to Jackie's waist and wearing a borrowed helmet, the crew pulled out of the parking lot in formation, their engines roaring like thunder, carrying her home like the precious cargo she was. That night, the story spread through the small town. Not the video the teenagers had tried to make, but a different story. One of bikers who stood up for a vulnerable woman, who showed that strength wasn't about intimidation, but protection, that toughness and tenderness could ride side by side. And Margaret, safely home in her quiet house, wrote in her journal something she hadn't written in 2 years. "Today I was reminded that there is still goodness in the world, that there are still people who see injustice and choose to stand against it, that I am not alone." The next Tuesday, when Margaret arrived at Rosie's diner, a dozen motorcycles were already parked outside. Bear and his crew had made it their new Tuesday tradition. A rolling guard of honor for one elderly woman who deserved to enjoy her coffee and pie in peace. And whenever new riders asked why they gathered there each week, Bear would tell them about courage, about his mother, about the day they'd chosen to be better than the worst of humanity. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Choose to be the ones who show up when it matters most.